From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The House January 6 inquiry holds its final hearing of the summer, but where does it go from here as Steve Bannon is found guilty of contempt of Congress? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial writer Monet Ukwe-Barua. Happy Friday to you both. On Thursday, the House January 6 inquiry was back in prime time for its last hearing of the summer. They say that they're going to do some more investigating over August and come back with more hearings in September. But maybe it's a good time to do some summing up of what we've learned and what we learned specifically from Thursday's hearing. Kim, is there anything that stuck out to you?
When I watched this, I think it just really drove home how much time passed, how much beseeching went on to President Trump to intervene, and how he simply and resolutely refused. And I think that that's a really important distinction because a lot of the conversation has been about how he failed to act. I think that it was said better by one of the panel members who said that it really wasn't so much about failing to act as choosing not to act. And that really comes across in this. There was one particular moment in the hearing where they talked about how a call was coming through to the White House from the Pentagon to discuss some sort of military response to what was happening at the Capitol. And it went unanswered because the president didn't want to engage in that question. He didn't want to do anything. And there was a lot of different testimony like that in terms of Mark Milley, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, just expressing his amazement that this was the commander-in-chief. There was an assault going on at the Capitol of the United States of America, and there's nothing. Like no call, nothing, zero, nothing happened. And I think it put like a slightly different cast on it, that this wasn't necessarily a president that wasn't sure what he should do. It was a president who it would appear really had made a decision that he wasn't going to stop anything that was happening.
I would agree with that summary, and I would add a couple things. So one question was when President Trump knew throughout the day that there was violence going on. And the committee says that after he gave his speech urging people to march to the Capitol, he was taken back to the White House. And as soon as he got in the Oval Office, according to the committee, he was told that there was violence breaking out. And then he went to the dining room in the West Wing from about 1:30 p.m., 1:30 in the afternoon to about 4 in the afternoon. And that is this 3-hour period, roughly, where they were saying that the president did nothing to help. And I think that was always the most damning part of his behavior that day. But I think this has added some more of the details. As Kim says, he did eventually issue an initial tweet urging people to respect the Capitol Police, for example, and then it ended and said, "Stay peaceful." And this was a notable piece of testimony, I thought, from Sarah Matthews, who worked in the White House press shop. And here she is describing a conversation she says she had with Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany regarding this tweet.
She looked directly at me and in a hushed tone shared with me that the president did not want to include any sort of mention of peace in that tweet, and that it took some convincing on their part, those who were in the room. And she said that there was a back and forth going over different phrases to find something that he was comfortable with. And it wasn't until Ivanka Trump suggested the phrase "stay peaceful" that he finally agreed to include it.
I'd point also to some outtakes of a video that President Trump shot and released, I think on January 7th. And here is the president sort of editing the script of the video as he's giving it.
This election is now over. Congress has certified the results. I don't want to say the election's over. I just want to say Congress has certified the results without saying the election's over, okay?
But Congress is certified. Now Congress.
Yeah, right.
Now Congress.
I didn't say over, so let me see.
Monet, this is some remarkable testimony. I mean, the president essentially having to be cajoled to tell the rioters at the Capitol to stay peaceful. And then even after the riot, without any introspection, it seems to me, or any regret on the next day, saying, I don't want to say the election is over. And remember, this is 2 months after the election.
Right. I think incredible is a fitting description of all the details that you just provided us with. I think that to go back to the moment of the riot as it was unfolding and President Trump being informed that violence had broken out and then going to the dining room, it's really, really jarring to basically contemplate the fact that the president of the United States was witnessing the Capitol riot basically the same way that everyone in America was, which is to say, as a passive viewer. We don't know exactly what he was feeling moment by moment, or if he felt that it was playing out the way that he would have liked. But we do know that basically he was watching on cable news and doing his best to avoid having to make any decision about how the government should respond to it. Giving an order to send troops to the Capitol is something that he delayed for quite a long time and didn't want to put out a statement in a way that would potentially signal to the rioters that he was not in favor of what was going on there. And then the response to that seems to be in keeping with how President Trump reacted to the election results sort of all along after November, basically doing everything he possibly could to avoid us showing that he thought there was any legitimacy in Joe Biden's victory, in part, I think, because he just didn't want to signal to his own supporters that he had given up. I mean, part of his message always surrounded not giving an inch, never making any kind of concession, and even once it had boiled over to the point of his supporters actively trying to overturn the result in the Capitol, he still was extremely unwilling to just do or say anything that would signal that he was in favor of reconciling.
And remarkably, President Trump is still at it today. This is from a statement he put out on Truth Social, his social media website. And it's referring to the bill that was released this week to reform the Electoral Count Act. We talked about that on a previous podcast. But here's the Trump statement. Mike Pence told me and everybody else there was nothing he could do about the electoral vote count. It was etched in stone. But if so, how come the Democrats and rhinos are working so hard to make sure there's nothing a VP could do? This was a major event because everybody ganged up and said that Mike had no choice. He could not send the slates back to the states, which is all I suggested he do for possible retabulation and correction based on large-scale voter fraud and irregularities. This may have proven to be an election-changing event, unquote. And so there it is, Kim. We're getting close to a point where the president is thinking, or his advisors at least are talking. The reports are that he is considering announcing an early campaign for president in 2024, possibly as early as September, possibly before the November midterm elections. And here we have the president still disputing what went on January 6th, still arguing that Mike Pence made the wrong choice, that he lacked the courage to send the electors back to the states, and still looking back at 2020.
First of all, just on this point of the Electoral Count Act, let's be very clear. One of the reasons that members of Congress are now looking at updating that is simply because it was ambiguous, okay? Now, Donald Trump can make the argument all he wants that in that ambiguity was some clear power for Mike Pence to overturn the rules of the election. Although think about that for just a minute. That is essentially the president of the United States suggesting that the vice president just gets to decide whenever he wants who really won an election. It's quite a startling grant of power, and one that not really any constitutional lawyer thinks is the case. And indeed, all that really matters here is that in that ambiguity, Mike Pence, as he has explained to the public many times now, consulted his own very respected constitutional lawyers, all of whom came back and told him that he did not have the ability, the power to do this. And, you know, again, there were a few outliers who were making an opposite case to Donald Trump, but the important question is just how few those were compared to the vast majority of the legal field who I think quite sensibly said, no, it doesn't make a lot of sense of the Constitution, just hands election results over to one man. So there's that, okay? And he can continue to argue that all he wants, but it was definitely a minority opinion and one that would be quite dangerous. And yes, here we have the president talking about running again. Supposedly he's been having meetings with donors. But your point about looking back highlights the danger, I think, to the Republican Party of the president jumping into that race, because he would be doing it with a backward look. He wants to be able to triumph over all of this. But as we saw with those Georgia Senate races, when you're focused on these past grievances, you're going to end up alienating a lot of people, demoralizing a lot of people. The electorate's made pretty clear they'd like to be moving forward and talking about next steps.
I do think that's true. And it does seem to me that the January 6th hearings are making some effect, because there are polls that seem to show the percentage of people who think that President Trump was responsible for what happened or that he was not telling the truth about these fraud claims, those numbers seem to be going up. And yet, Monet, the juxtaposition is that all the polls of likely Republican primary voters seem to suggest that a really good share of them, sometimes a majority, are still intending to pick President Trump as their nominee again in 2024 if they're asked. And so I can't quite figure out how to square that circle. Other than that, we're not in a real campaign right now. There's no alternative that is being offered, and there's not debates going on where these candidates that might run in 2024 are going head to head.
Right. I think it was given after President Trump left office that he was going to remain a very large presence within the Republican Party. And we've seen that as some of the primaries have played out over the past few months. He doesn't have a 100% track record or anything close to it in terms of getting his favored candidates nominated, but it's very clear when you look at races like Ohio Senate in particular, sometimes when President Trump weighs in and wraps his arms around one of the candidates, you do see a big bump, and that's a testimony to his staying power. I think that as more people tune in, we'll get a better sense of whether they are still really warm to him or whether it merely is the fact that he's so visible, that people liked how he performed as president, that is accounting for him still remaining fairly high in the polls. I do think that it's possible that the January 6th committee hearings are having some impact on pushing down support for President Trump. It could also just be the passing of time and more people starting to tune in to politics actively as the midterms come up. But it is an open question. I don't think that there's anyone who could really say they know exactly what to expect in terms of Trump's potential viability as a 2024 candidate and what are the factors that are making people start to diminish in their support for him as time has gone on.
Hang tight. We'll be right back. You're listening to Potomac Watch from the Wall Street Journal.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. So let's talk a little bit about where the January 6th committee goes from here. And maybe the place to start is a statement that Liz Cheney, a member of the January 6th committee, made during Thursday's hearing.
Doors have opened, new subpoenas have been issued, and the dam has begun to break. And now, even as we conduct our 9th hearing, we have considerably more to do. We have far more evidence to share with the American people and more to gather. So our committee will spend August pursuing emerging information on multiple fronts before convening further hearings this September.
A piece of related news is that former Trump advisor Steve Bannon has now been found guilty on 2 counts of contempt of Congress for defying a subpoena from this committee. And Kim, what do you make of that guilty verdict and the arguments of privilege or not here? And I mean, do you suppose that a guilty verdict here will change the debate that some of these other potential witnesses are having, these negotiations that they're having with the committee about whether they'll testify and on what terms?
So the Bannon convictions, this is interesting, although I'd point out that I always thought that Steve Bannon had the absolute weakest case in terms of various people who have been referred for contempt of Congress or have been accused by the committee of flouting duly issued subpoenas. Bannon had used a variety of arguments as for why he missed the subpoena dates to comply. He had argued along the way in this trial that the subpoena was issued improperly, it wasn't signed correctly, that he maybe fell under the banner of executive privilege, given that he had engaged in conversations with the president, that his attorneys also argued that everyone understands that subpoena deadlines are negotiable and malleable. It's about trying to set up a time, and he was going to come in, but we were still negotiating with the committee over the terms of the discussions that we would have. In the end, the jury clearly decided that none of this held up to scrutiny and that what mattered was the deadline on the subpoena and that he had not met it and that it was issued by Congress and that these other arguments didn't necessarily hold. Now, again, I think to this point, this was not a person who worked in the White House, so the arguments of executive privilege were incredibly stretched. I think that the rest of the people that are in potential investigation or under questions of contempt who have refused to negotiate or deal with the committee are in different positions. Each one is its own set of circumstances, because the closer you get to the president, for instance, we talked about Pat Cipollone, the former general counsel, that's about as close as you get to the president. And his job was to offer unfettered legal advice. And people have noted that gets to the heart of executive privilege. If you can't speak freely and you know that you might get subpoenaed at any time, then you won't speak freely. So the courts are going to have to, and then the Department of Justice will have to work through each of these on a case-by-case basis. In this particular case, again, this was a person that didn't really have much of a claim, in my mind, to argue that he had any choice but to appear in front of the committee.
But I do start to wonder when we're talking about the committee coming back for September hearings, at what point they hit diminishing returns on the information that they're able to get and put out into public. And I admit that I'm unusual because I'm occupationally required to watch all of this end to end. And I've lost count now if this is the 7th or the 8th hearing that this committee has held. Not all of them have been in prime time, but it does seem to me that it is getting harder to pick out the new bits from stuff that is a broader narrative or is chunks of previous hearings that are kind of being recycled. And maybe the point there, Monet, is to have an effect on the public who is not watching the hearings that take place at 10 in the morning or at 2 in the afternoon because people are at work. Maybe the point is to get some of that information in front of them. But I do wonder if, unless there are some other witnesses that come forward that they're able to pin down on this stuff, at what point the committee just ends up kind of going in circles.
Right. I think we can all agree that there are certainly a lot of open questions that the committee has not necessarily provided clear answers to during the course of its run over the past couple of months. But I can't say that I'm optimistic about whether we can expect subsequent hearings in the fall to provide clear answers to those questions. I'll put it this way. I think that you could divide all of the testimony that we've seen in the committee thus far between Cassidy Hutchinson and everybody else. And I think that Cassidy Hutchinson testimony did raise very substantial new questions that, if the conclusions that she's pointing to are true, would significantly increase the weight of the charges being made against President Trump. For example, she alleged that Trump had known that several members of the crowd at his rally were armed and that he had asked that the magnetometers be removed. Cassidy Hutchinson also claimed that when President Trump was informed that people were calling for Pence to be hanged, that Trump had said that he deserved it. And then finally, she claimed that President Trump asked Mark Meadows to call Roger Stone after the rioting broke out in a way that suggested that there might have been some kind of coordination between President Trump and someone directly involved in the riot. So we still don't know if any of those charges are true, but they had quite a lot of weight. And so I would say that if we were looking for something to come out of subsequent hearings substantially, it would be trying to get some corroboration from the strongest claims that have been made against President Trump, as opposed to just sort of showing more details about what he was doing during the time of the riots. We kind of know what he was doing, showing more of the sort of horrible actions of the rioters. We've seen those. We really want to get answers to these key questions that are still outstanding.
I think that also has to be weighed against a bigger risk for the committee. Just that, remember, when we went into this endeavor earlier in the summer, a huge chunk of the country, in fact, probably about half, maybe that much, but close to, was pretty cynical about this particular body to begin with, given the makeup of the committee, the way it came about, the fact that Republicans were not allowed to sit on it, and that Nancy Pelosi was vetoing Kevin McCarthy's picks. But I think the risk to the committee as they go along is that this becomes to be seen even by some people who might have paid attention in the beginning, say independents, as more and more of a political exercise, of a kind of an engagement in political chicanery. Never forget that when both sides were still talking originally about setting up this committee, one of the things that Republicans had demanded and Democrats had initially even agreed to was that the committee was going to attempt to finish up its work by the end of last year so that there would not be any suggestion that this was being used by the majority Democratic Party to somehow influence voters in the run-up to the election. You now have a committee that doesn't seem to care about that issue issue at all and seems more than willing to just go wading and wallowing right into election season while continuing to hold primetime hearings. Again, I think that risks turning off some people who might otherwise be willing to listen.
And on that point, to air a complaint that we've voiced before, I don't understand why the committee is holding all of the evidence it is gathering so tightly and not releasing full transcripts of the interviews it's doing. We know the committee has interviewed Pat Cipollone, who was President Trump's counsel, his White House counsel. And Pat Cipollone has said in those interviews, that, because we've seen clips of it, that he won't talk about conversations he had with the president. That's privileged. But he has offered all sorts of other interesting testimony. And boy, it would be vital, I think, to make sense of this, to see the whole transcript, see what he said. And to pick on a clip that I used today, we had Sarah Matthews describing a conversation that she had with Kayleigh McEnany, describing a conversation that took place in the Oval Office with the president, reportedly about this tweet, this language about stay peaceful in this tweet. But we also know that the committee has interviewed Kayleigh McEnany directly, the White House press secretary. So what did she say about that exchange? Does she have a different recollection of that? And maybe there are similar problems where she wouldn't describe conversations that she had directly with the president, but maybe she could describe whether her conversation with Sarah Matthews matches what Matthews says about it. And Monet, it gets a little bit tangled here. I don't understand why the committee won't clear a lot of this up by just giving us the lists of who they've talked to. Let us see the transcripts. Let us see all of the evidence, put it out there, and then people can pick through it. And that would be the answer to the claims by the president's defenders that this is all just a cherry-picked exercise.
Right. I think that gets directly to the point that Kim was making, which is that at the end of the day, this is fundamentally being used as a political instrument by the Democrats who convened the committee. Yes, I do think that there's an opportunity through these hearings to uncover a lot of substantial new details about what took place on January 6th, what President Trump's motivations were. But they certainly want to disseminate those details that they find in the way that's going to have the most dramatic effect and that's going to portray President Trump in the worst possible light. So with something like the Cipollone interview, I believe that they spoke to him for about 8 hours. They got quite a lot of testimony from him, and we only ever really saw snippets. He was surely asked directly about some of those claims that I was just mentioning that came from Cassidy Hutchinson. We didn't really get direct answers. We don't know how candid he was. It's very possible that he was trying to kind of, dodge giving direct answers to some of these questions that might have been self-incriminating. We can only speculate about that. But still, it doesn't really seem as if there would be any harm in releasing the full transcripts in the way that you described. And I think that if the committee were as serious as they claim to be about sort of trying to establish the definitive record about what took place, we would see them being much, much more transparent in terms of getting the full testimonies out from Cipollone and a lot of the other key witnesses.
Thank you, Monet and Kim. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast app, and we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.